the president of Lift Park Group. Um, the show today is going to be a little bit different. It's a continuation of what we were talking about on Monday. It's this Space Futures workshop document that we're going to go through a little bit. Before I do that, that's going to take up the second half of the show. But before I do that, I want to point out 15 years ago, the long before there was a Space Force, there was a strategic space office at the Air Force. And they commissioned a report. It was unlike anything that had ever happened to look at space-based solar power. And it was a pretty big deal. Unfortunately, it didn't get a lot of traction. It did get some. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I'll tell you, space-based solar power has been near and dear to my heart. It is the reason I got into space in the first place. All the way back in 2000 and 2001, my internet company was closing. I was at a transition point in my career. And kind of trying to figure out like what I was going to do when I grow up. I mean, I know that's kind of a joke, but I was in my early 30s, I think maybe 32. And a mentor of mine, a guy named Ralph Nansen, had worked on some really early Department of Energy and Boeing projects to look at space-based solar power. And this is reports and research done in the end of the 80s that was basically mothballed. And he wanted to build a space-based solar power company. And I was at this point where I knew I wasn't going to stay with the internet stuff anymore. I was done with that. I had my building, so I had a pretty decent income for my age, just based off of the building, not anything else. And so I was at this crossroads. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And Nansen introduced me to the concept of space-based solar power. And it was kind of boggling. It was kind of, I don't know, it just exploded my brain. Like I'd never heard of such a thing. I'd never heard of such a big concept. And in my own history, in my early 20s, 10 years before, I had just gotten out of the Marine Corps and I was working in a small investment firm down in Portland. And my boss asked me to do a project on international energy infrastructure. And it's a long story, but the short version is I came back to him one day. I said, I'm sorry, I can't figure this out because all of my data is wrong. He's like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, by my numbers, and again, this is 1992, 1993 era, by my 1991, 1992. I said, by my numbers, we're already out of energy. So obviously I've got something wrong here. And he was frustrated and we threw my report out, like months of work, into the trash. And I still wonder if maybe I was right all the way back then, that we were already up against an energy crisis just that no one knew about at the time. And so then fast forward to 2002, 10 years later, here's this revolutionary, and I use that word on purpose, this revolutionary idea to build solar panels out in the sky above all of the great cities of the world, and power each city independently with clean, green, limitless energy. And I'll tell you, I was hooked. That was it for me. That is what I wanted to do. And then Ralph asked me to join his company, and he asked me to lead his company because he was an older guy, retired from Boeing. He asked me to lead his company, and it was really tempting. It was really tempting. I wanted to do it, but I kept coming up with, well, how are we, like, even if it works, even if the technology is possible, how are we going to do it? There was no mechanism for heavy lift launch. And if you understand silicon solar panels, silica is glass. Glass is heavy. If you're going to make, miles of a flat surface in space, that's really heavy, and that means it's really expensive. And this is back in 2001, 2000 era, 2000 even in 2001. And the idea of, what we now have and almost take for granted is a robust rocketry industry that didn't exist back then. So the prices to get to orbit, that was space shuttle prices. That was $50,000, $45,000 to get something to orbit on the space shuttle. It was the only thing big enough to carry that much mass. You could have done it with smaller rockets. There were some Atlas and Deltas, I think, back then. But still, you couldn't have built a cost-effective system that couldn't have produced enough power. So the idea was brilliant. You would take these solar panels, position them over the top 300 cities of the world, the largest 300 cities of the world, and thereby power 40% of the global population. That was technologically doable, but not financially possible. As they say, the business case didn't close. So it's actually because of space-based solar power that I decided to get into space in the first place. Specifically, why I got into working on the space elevator specifically, because I wanted a way to lift this ultra heavy mass and power the world. So that was the plan. That was a long time ago, nearly a quarter century ago. And so fast forward, I start working on the elevator. I think you all know that story, 2001, 2, and 3 under the NASA Institute for Advanced Concepts. I was a contractor there. And then 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7, I started the first version of Liftport. And it was all with an idea towards building space-based solar power. So just as Liftport is closing the first time, there's a bunch of folks working together to do maybe the first real formal study of space-based solar power. So I'm going to share this link here. And it's funny because 15 years ago, this was considered the state-of-the-art document. This was the best there was out there. And it was pretty well received. I'm going to share the document here in a moment. It was pretty well received, kind of, I would say, in Nerdsville. Let's scroll down here for a second. The National Security Space Office was basically the highest level think tank that the Air Force had to offer for space stuff. And what they were trying to do is figure out how to build the first system. And it was called a feasibility study, which is kind of appropriate for the technology that they had at the time. And it was crazy because the professional space community did not take this thing very seriously. I wish that they had. Garrison's lament a couple days ago, and I saw this on LinkedIn, was that, imagine where we would be in the development if this document was taken seriously 15 years ago. But importantly, I'm going to share this screen instead. The National Space Society, they've been around for 30 some years. Their big conferences this week. So if you're going to Texas, have fun. It's going to be a great adventure this week. I usually am a participant at that, but I am not going this year. But the NSS, National Space Society, has been really supportive of, has been really supportive of the idea of space-based solar power. They have been for a really long time. So you can find the document itself on that page. But there's other stuff here too. They've got some photos, some audio, they've had some conferences. So they actually have quite a bit of stuff around. They have a whole library here, their space solar power library, and they've got a homepage. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, I definitely recommend it. The NSS is probably the strongest public advocate of this technology. Now, fast forward, Air Force Research Lab does in fact have some experiments going right now. We've had some of their people on earlier incarnations of this show. Maybe it was 2 years ago. So there definitely is a lot that's happening in this sector, but boy, it has taken a long time. It has taken a long time. So this document, what is it? Well, first of all, they did it digitally over internet discussions. So now we would completely take that for granted, but 15 years ago to do research virtually was virtually impossible. So that in itself was pretty innovative. They did not have a very big budget for this thing, so that they were able to pull it off at all is pretty interesting. I was a part of that study. There's a funny moment here. I am not named by name, and I'm not named. The company is not named. But there's 2 references to space elevator in here. They don't say it's. Whoops. Let's do that again. This is all we got. What would be the mode of transportation for the materials? Further alternatives include gun launch, electromagnetic or maglev, a space elevator, or a hybrid tether system or sky crane, where suborbital launch vehicles dock with the bottom of the boosted tether and then climb their way up. Launch from the moon or asteroids is typically via electromagnetic means, otherwise known as a mass driver. So that is it. That is out of, gosh, I don't know how many pages this is, 75 pages. That's all we got, is like one simple sentence. I thought it was in here twice. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Okay. So that's it. That's all they wanted. I was still working on the Earth elevator at the time, so I was not looking at the lunar system. I am still convinced that building an elevator on the moon is the fastest way to build space-based solar power systems. This document's worth reading. It's definitely worth it for the historic elements. Their study group was a bunch of people, nearly 200 folks, all contributing, their best knowledge. It was my first interaction. I don't think I met Colonel Garretson at the time. I was speaking to Colonel Smith, Coyote Smith. He was my main point of contact back then. So that was the first time I'd ever encountered those folks. Look, the recommendations, build it. I mean, it's not any more complicated than that. Retire technical risk, retire business development risk. I think their architecture is a little dated now. This picture still pops up in the literature. This is still one of the most popular designs. John Mankins and his company have evolved this quite a bit. Every time I see this picture, I think it's a space elevator, not a sun tower. So there's some cool stuff in here. At the end of the day, the Department of Defense was in the middle of wars in the desert. Their forward energy costs, their base costs for their forward deployments, $100 a gallon, not $100 a barrel, $100 a gallon for military vehicles operating in an extreme environment. So they were looking as, could you use concentrated space-based solar power on very specific use cases? Could you power a forward base in a way that didn't require diesel, right? And when they calculate $100 a gallon, that was because people were dying transporting fuel from rear bases to forward emplacements. The roads were bombed. The roads had a whole bunch of improvised explosive devices. So the idea that they could take energy from the sky, beam it down to the ground, that was pretty revolutionary, and it did get some attention. I think that's kind of all I'm going to tell you about this. It's worth reading if this is the area that you're interested in. Very importantly, the UK, United Kingdom, in just the last few months has taken this idea very seriously. One of my classmates from ISU has been pushing this, and Angeliki Kapeglau. She's been pushing this at the European Space Agency ministers meetings. And maybe 6 months ago or so, they got some funding to start doing some work. And definitely the UK is taking this on. So it's funny that this was an idea that was invented in the United States, pushed in the United States, and ultimately we might lose control of the leading position because we delayed. This report's been out for 15 years, and there has been very little action on it. So I'm going to recommend it. I think it's fun. There's a lot here. I mean, if you're really a nerd and want to look into this stuff, there's a lot here. Oh yeah, L-Kratz. This is when I first started really spending any time with Garretson and Smith. So yeah, that was neat stuff. Okay, that's it. I'm gonna kind of be done with that, unless there are some questions. There are not any questions. Okay, cool. There is a point from, yeah, here we go. Here, let's talk about this. Thanks. There's a point from the audience. So I just mentioned the Air Force Research Lab is doing space power beaming. They have a couple experiments. The Spider one is the biggest one. I think they have 3. This one's in orbit or just came down. Sorry, that should have been off. Yeah, okay, so there's a couple. Spiral, Arachne, Spindle. So those are all kind of in development. Let me post this link here. Thanks, Leah. Appreciate that. So this video is worth watching for sure. I'm not going to play it because it feels a little contrived to play a video on the video channel. But this video is definitely worthwhile on the YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to close out talking about space-based solar power. Okay. Let me switch gears here. Okay, I talked a little bit about this Space Futures document a couple days ago on Monday. And I lost my page here. Dang it. Too many tabs open. You've heard me mention about Dr. Mosier many times. Pretty interesting guy, pretty fascinating guy. So this is from 2 years ago. But this futures document that we're going to showcase here, this has been 5 years in the making, 6 years in the making. I think the first one was 2017 or 18. So I'm going to leave this here. You can review it as you need. But this futures process is really important. So we talked about it a bit on Monday. So I'm going to go into it some more. Next week, we're going to dig into the bottom of this. There are these vignettes, these stories that we're going to dig into, pretty kind of fun. I think it should be kind of a fun exercise. I would love to have some communications from our audience. If anybody wants to be a part of that, that would be really fun. I'm going to post the link here. So this document, it informs, it is not the Space Futures 2023 document. This one is going to add information to that future doc. So at the end of this, they've got some really interesting ideas of how developing cislunar space impacts U.S. Space Force. And some of these stories of potential problems that Space Force folks are going to have to deal with, I think they're pretty fun. They're real world scenarios. And again, I want to stress, this document was paid for by the Department of Defense, Air Force Research Lab, Defense Innovation Unit, New Space New Mexico, and the Office of the Chief Scientist of Space Force. So, trying to understand from their perspective what the future looks like is pretty important. I mentioned Mosier earlier, just a few minutes ago. We were having a conversation about how, just the right bag of sand, the right sandbag launched into orbit and then, dispersed could be a really bad day. And everybody knows that. Like, there's nothing classified about that scenario. It's called Pearl Harbor in space. It's got a name. It's kind of a big deal. But so they took that idea of sandbags in space and they said, okay, well, let's apply it to the moon. And then we just read this directly. The US has subsidized a basic power grid on the moon to enable an expanding lunar industrial facility. An unfriendly competitor has a quote unquote emergency requiring it to thrust in an area creating sandblast, which severely damages a megawatt lunar nuclear facility. This requires immediate aid, enabling rapid retrofit of radiators and personnel to fix them and/or evacuation of lunar personnel. Long-term shutdown could make the U.S. facility non-economically viable. Abandonment could cede key terrain to occupation by the competitor. The commercial tenant requests emergency support from U.S. Space Force. So on Monday, we were talking about how 4-star General Salzman doesn't think that their mission really adds up to the requirements, right? The mission, in his words, was kind of a dud. So here you've got, and this is, I think this vignette is a very possible scenario. Here you've got a commercial operator, having sand thrown in his face, kicked in his face. And all of a sudden, does U.S. Space Force have to respond? Do they have a role? That's an as yet undecided question, right? So we're going to tackle several of these vignettes. We're going to definitely focus on the lunar ones especially, but there are several in here that are very interesting. So I'm going to skip all that. I'm going to go back to where we left off the other day. As a refresher, there's a couple parts to this document, but the piece I want to pay attention to is the stuff we didn't work on the other day. How big is the space economy, right? And this is in 2032 terms or 2045 terms. They think that the very smallest is $6 trillion. 2032, I'd be really surprised if we hit that mark by then. We're at $500 billion now. That's 12x growth in less than 10 years. That seems challenging, but not impossible. I definitely don't agree with a $10 trillion economy. That's half the economy of the United States, the current economy of the United States. So I think they're on the high side, but I could live with the 6 trillion. I might have put it between the 4 to 6 number myself, but there's a lot of smart people that did this analysis, so this has been the number they agreed to. And then what do you absolutely have to have? Well, you need internet connection, reliable communications architecture. We all take that for granted. This call that we're on right now is only possible because of we take data for granted, but we can't take data for granted in space. The architecture isn't there. The infrastructure isn't built out yet. So how do we support 99.9% uptime? That's going to be a really tricky question, right? What capabilities need to be defended? Data architecture, logistics, and spectrum agnostic communications, right? We need to be able to broadcast what we want, where we want, when we want, and we got to know that the data is real. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. It is definitely worth reading this document to get into some of the details here, because there's some pretty important stuff in here. I paid less attention to the 2045 extrapolations, mostly because I think it's really hard to predict that far out. I've got a reasonably accurate crystal ball, but I'm usually off by half a decade to a decade. I mean, consistently off by half a decade or a decade. So I try to rein in my expectations, but I don't think you can make really good guesstimates that far out. All right, so their optimistic narratives are that the U.S. has the majority of market share of a $10 trillion economy. I do think we probably will have a dominant role. You've already heard me question the $10 trillion number. And it's funny is that I don't really have good evidence for a number one way or the other. So I am biasing on the low side. But if you watch the internet grow from 1995 till now, easily that surpasses a $10 trillion economy. So is space going to grow at the same level, the same speed? I really don't know. I think it might. So that might be me reversing my opinion, just like on the fly. All right. And the other side is we only have half of the market share, and it's only a $6 trillion market. China is working really hard to build out their space infrastructure. And one of the advantages of an autocratic system like theirs is that they decide to fund something, that thing gets funded. And they are doing that. They are doing that in space. New space stations, new lunar development, new rocketry, credit where it's not due. There's a lot of copycat stuff there. But nevertheless, I mean, there is a strong chance that they are going to put a lot of capital behind going to space. And if they do, that definitely makes it financially challenging, because the systems that we operate under are different, and I don't know. I have a hard time thinking that America will cede that big an advantage. But if we do, that's going to be a game changer for the world. I was in an event a couple days ago, and I said that whomever controls EML1 controls cislunar space, and if you control cislunar space, you control the world. So it is the most valuable real estate in the solar system, and we're pretty determined to get there soon. I'm going to skip some of this because I want to spend time on some of these graphics. So let me just scroll down. I don't want to miss anything, but this again, 75 pages, there's 73 pages. There's a lot to this, and it's worth digging into it. Still looking for the piece I was looking for. Okay, I'm going to skip this stuff and just scroll down to the graphics. These narratives are also good. Optimistic and pessimistic narratives for 2045. Um, uh, we're just talking about space-based solar power. So again, this is all fiction, right? This is just a fictional story that makes you want to think about stuff. By 2032, the European Space Agency and the Chinese space solar power demos are successful, drawing wide-scale investment in heavy launch at scale and lunar industrialization. By the way, that is exactly where I want our world to go to. I really do want that to happen. Tourism has expanded. SpaceX is operating a low-cost transportation to the moon and has begun deploying significant infrastructure. I would argue that this document came out in November of 22, and just last week, in May of 23, Blue Origin landed a $3.4 billion contract to go to the moon. So I don't think it's just a SpaceX only game. And I think that's important. So that's new information, right? So I'll continue reading. SpaceX is operating a low-cost transportation to the moon and has begun deploying significant infrastructure. Lunar power and human presence are doubling annually. Doubling, cool. Doubling, 1 to 2, great. A year goes by. 2 to 4, a year goes by. 4 to 8, a year goes by. It doesn't take long for that to turn into a pretty big number. The worldwide demand for space-based solar power and nuclear power production has matured significantly, driving expanded production of finished goods. The combination of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotic technology achieves partial self-replication. So I love the idea of 100,000 metric tons per year coming off of the moon. That would be neat. I would like that. So I like that scenario. The opposite is in 2032, Starship explodes during a fueling in orbit, resulting in complete loss of life of all 86 passengers. Oops. News outlets show photos of frozen corpses, and the event is live streamed. That is very possible. I just, my little editorial here is that is really a thing that could happen. The industrial sector relies so heavily on lift capability, this event has had outsized impact across the sector, and progress stalls. Investment in space is significantly reduced. Commercial interest has slowed. Companies dependent on Starship's reduced launch costs have collapsed. The demand for power and infrastructure has fizzled. Chinese progress continues and surpasses progress made by the US and its allies. The Artemis program collapses. China becomes the primary provider of space technology and services. Power generation projects are behind schedule. So that could be a problem, right? And that's the fun of playing with crystal balls, right? Like it could go both directions. It could be everything is awesome. We start getting a lot of power systems built, like I just described. 40% of the world's population could be energy independent, or nothing, right? So I think that's kind of fun. I'm not going to get into the Space Force takeaways. We're going to keep going. Again, I'm only hitting highlights. This document, there's some pretty cool stuff in here. This list, by the way, this is the attendees list. This is definitely worth paying attention to. I have stories about a lot of these people. I don't think it's appropriate that I share those stories, but I will say that we've had Dr. Zahir on our show. Casey Angla-Durad has been on our show. Greg Autry has been on our show several times. we have asked Stephen Buteau several times to join us. He has not, except for under the heading of the Foundation for the Future when we did the Blue Marble Week and Conversations for the Future. Bradley Cheatham's been on an earlier incarnation of the show. So I tell you all this because, you know, our show's pretty cool and you should go back and watch, you know, earlier episodes. And of course, I've mentioned Garrettson several times. Let me see. Dr. Mosier, I mentioned him several times. He's been on our show. I told you he was going to be on our show. It's probably going to be June. Speaking of which, we just got notified that Lori Garver and Bob Werb are going to be on our show soon, so that's going to be neat. Let's see. I don't think there's anybody else. Oh, nope. Yeah, so I know a lot of other people in this thing, but those were the ones I wanted to highlight because they have been on various shows that we've had. Okay. So some of the stats, some of the demographics that came out of this. So before the meeting happened with almost 70 people in Colorado Springs, they sent out a survey, and the survey is now closed, but this is the part I kind of wanted to get into. So there were about 70 people that responded to this survey. Mid-career, late career, early career. Me, I filled out this form, so I'm going to show you what I said compared to everybody else. So we're a small company. I have more than 25 years, so I'm in this category. So that's the largest category. That's 17 out of 70. I think it's 69 people. So a lot of this was very, very commercially focused, right? You add this number and this number and this number, you start getting very commercially focused survey. And I said that I probably would not go to space. That is not my driver. I mean, I think it's neat, and I would go if I'm able. But I'm a go for a vacation kind of guy. But I'm also the kind of guy who's, you know, been to 49 of the 50 states, and I've never made it to Hawaii. So I'm probably going to go to Hawaii before I go to space. I just don't take vacations. So I don't see me being a realistic candidate for this. And again, I'm in the late career, so I'm here. I'm actually kind of an outlier. I was a little surprised by that. Questions. We're gonna do this individually. What will be the level of space activity and assets in 2032 compared with today? I think anybody who is listening to this show is going to probably be on the optimistic side and say far higher level today than today. And they're saying more than double. I think it's going to be way more than double. I think that's going to be important. What are the factors that are more important by 2032? Commercial space investment. 3/4 of the respondents said commercial space sector. Well, that's fine, but again, look at how it's biased. Most of the respondents came from the commercial sector. So, no surprise they're going to say 50 of the 69, 51 of the 69 said commercial sector. I also was optimistic about legislation and regulation. Watching the Artemis Accords expand, 24 nations now had a small role in nudging the Czech Republic, the most recent signator. So I was pretty happy to see that. But yeah, there's going to be more space investment from both the civil and the defense sector. I definitely think there's going to be more nations joining. I don't think it's a space race in the traditional sense, but I do think there's a space race between the United States and China. So the competition, I think, is going to be significant. There's going to be a role there, and I do think that the technology development is going to play a really important role. I was kind of surprised that global economic health was even on the chart, so a little surprised by that. Which factors will be greater? The commercial sector, this chart doesn't really tell me anything new, except that, again, this one, the governments, the NGOs, the defense sector, they don't seem to have a lot of confidence in their own role in all this, and they're not saying it's a big factor. So I think that's a little surprising. I think I'm gonna skip this one. It's kind of an eye chart, and frankly, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. This we talked about a little bit on Monday. I was very surprised at this one. This one is probably the one that surprises me either the most or the second most. And this isn't me being a former U.S. Marine and waving my American flag here. I'm just looking at the straight numbers. The dollars invested is higher here. The number of commercial companies is higher here. Space Force is an economic force here. NASA is an economic force here. I really don't think there's much chance that we're not going to be the undisputed leader. Unless China really surprises me, I don't think Europe could overtake us, and that would be the only threat other than China, and I just don't see that happening. It would be a failure of leadership for that to happen. So I'm just really skeptical of this, and I was shocked that so many people said one of the leaders. Now that said, I'm very impressed with the Indian space program, the Israeli space program, the combined work of 17 nations in Europe. That's a great space program. I've said lots of times that United Arab Emirates has a very surprising Martian program. So there are definitely going to be new and emergent leaders, but they're not going to be leading the United States. I would definitely bet my reputation on that one. Yeah. Again, remember, this was a US DoD funded report, so I suspect most of the respondents are American, although I have not seen stats for that. So according to this, we're going to lead. I just lost my page. Sorry, I lost you for a second. I think I'm still alive. Okay, I'm alive still. Okay, good. I lost you for a second. Give me a second, come back. The commercial sector is going to lead, one of the leaders. I don't know that this gives us all that much. I was surprised that none of the large commercial companies said that we were going to be the undisputed leader. That is boggling to me. None of the defense people said we were going to be the undisputed leader. That is boggling to me. It also makes me wonder if the defense people know something that I don't know. So maybe I'm going into this with a little bit of rose-colored glasses. But that really surprises me. No commercial sector respondents said we were going to be the leader, and no defense respondents said we were going to be the leader. Yeah, so that really surprises me. And I really don't understand who says we're going to be commercially following. I don't understand that. I do know that the UK has done a really great job in building up their small sat community and ecosystem. I don't understand this chart. I don't think it's any different from before. That doesn't make any sense. How many countries will have active space military services like U.S. Space Force? Spoiler alert, there's already 4, right? There's U.S., UK, France was first after us, China, and Australia is building one. So there's 4 active and the 5th in development. That's current. So whoever wrote 5 and 5, they're kind of late to the party. So there are going to be, quote, more than today. That's the only answer. But it's going to be most major space nations will have a defense component. Space Force was a long time coming. It was first proposed during the Reagan era. It was then later proposed under Bush's 1 and 2. It was then later proposed, and it got its real defining characteristics at the end of the Obama administration, and then of course Trump finalized it. So it's been a long time coming, and other nations are already following this path. So yeah, the answer, more than today. This one has a little bit more nuance to it. It says most developed nations. This is my category. This is where I would say it is. I mean, it's a cop-out to say more than today, but this one is a little bit more nuanced. So that's where I landed. I love this chart. How many people will be in space at any given time in 2032? I'm in the 200 to 1,000 category. I love the optimists that think it's going to be more than 1,000. There are several space stations in development now, 3 governmental programs. And by the way, if you're talking in space, you're also talking about landed lunar settlements and potentially landed Martian settlements. By 2032, that seems like a stretch, but it does seem possible. And given our conversations on screen with Dr. Robert Zubrin, in 2032, there might be folks on Mars also. So I'm sitting in this 200 to 1,000 number, whereas the bulk of people were like, maybe we'll get 20 to 200. Again, spoiler alert, these folks that are like fewer than 20, we have 14 today. So give us 10 more years, give the world 10 more years. Yeah, we're gonna have more than 20. I'm 100% sure of that. So yeah, that's gonna happen. That's a thing. So this is also interesting. The folks with later careers, longer careers, are the ones that were the most optimistic. That's kind of cool, I think, right? They're the ones saying, me, I'm talking about me, we've got some experience, we've got some been there, done that street cred, and we're the one biasing towards these larger goals. Now, that's not to discount what's happening at the 20 to 200 line. But if you just look at the career stages, the older folks, the more experienced career folks are biasing towards more people in space. I think that's really neat. And again, it's this number of how many people are going to be in space by the kind of organization they're representing. Well, I showed you earlier, because this survey is biased towards commercial sector, it's not a surprise that the commercial sector has this bias in this chart. So I don't think that's very revelatory here. Which locations will be important to U.S. Space Force? Low Earth orbit, MEO orbit, GEO orbit, cislunar space, surface of the moon, space and celestial bodies beyond the moon. So only a few people, 12 people considered, 10 people considered space and bodies beyond the moon as irrelevant. Only 10%, 7 people out of 70, right? Everybody thinks, yeah, Leo for sure. 70%, if I'm reading that right, 78% say Leo. Geo, only 10% think that the moon and beyond the moon are critically important. Only 20% think that the moon is critically important. Well, I think you all know I am biasing towards this, right? The surface of the moon, cislunar space, those are where, that's Liftport's priority, right? So, okay. And this is my last comment here. How relevant do you believe U.S. Space Force is to your organization's plans for 2032? I think you all know that I said critically important, right? Critically relevant. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out. There's still more to this document. I'm not going to go over these again. I think we've done as far as we can go on it. We are going to talk about these vignettes. Probably it's not going to be on Monday because we have a guest. We have 2 guests on Monday, so that'll be fun. And it won't be the following Wednesday either, so it's probably a couple weeks out. So want to say thanks to all of my team. They're terrific. Thank you all for being a part of this. I couldn't do this stuff without y'all. And with that, I'm going to go. Thanks very much, y'all. Bye-bye.